When kindness stops being a choice at first, kindness feels like a decision, something conscious, something you choose because it matches the image you have of yourself. You help because you want to. You listen because you care. You give because it feels right. In the beginning, kindness is light. It feels clean. It feels voluntary. But slowly, almost invisibly, something changes. Kindness stops being a choice and starts becoming an obligation. You no longer pause to ask yourself whether you have the energy, the time, or the emotional space. You respond automatically. You show up by default. You give, not because you want to, but because not giving feels wrong. This is where kindness begins to transform into something else. It becomes a reflex built on fear rather than intention. Fear of disappointing, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as selfish, cold, or ungrateful. You tell yourself it's just who you are, but deep down you know that saying no feels heavier than saying yes. So you keep choosing yes, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. For many people, this pattern didn't begin in adulthood. It started early. Kindness became a survival strategy. Love was conditional. Approval was earned. Being easy, helpful, and agreeable felt safer than expressing needs or setting boundaries. You learned that your role was to accommodate, to smooth things over, to carry emotional weight quietly. Over time, that role hardens into identity. You don't just act kind, you become the kind one. And once that identity is locked in, stepping out of it feels like betrayal. From the outside, this version of kindness looks admirable. You're reliable, patient, understanding. People trust you, they lean on you, they come to you when things fall apart. But what rarely gets noticed is what this costs you internally. You don't feel free. You feel responsible. You feel pressure to maintain an image you never consciously agreed to uphold. Your kindness is no longer an expression of abundance. It's a defense mechanism designed to keep rejection, abandonment, and guilt at bay. This is the moment when kindness stops being nourishing and starts being draining. You help even when you're exhausted. You listen even when you're overwhelmed. You give even when nothing is left. And because you're used to minimizing yourself, you don't call this suffering. You call it being strong. You call it being mature. You call it being a good person. Meanwhile, your own needs quietly lose their importance. They begin to feel inconvenient, excessive, or unjustified. The most dangerous part is how subtle this shift is. There's no clear breaking point, no dramatic collapse, just a slow erosion of self. You begin to feel tension when your phone rings, resentment when someone asks for just one more thing, guilt when you imagine pulling back. You may not even realize that you're angry, because anger doesn't fit the identity you've built. So it turns inward. It becomes numbness, fatigue, emotional distance from yourself. This is not kindness as a moral virtue. This is kindness as a contract, an unspoken agreement where your worth is measured by how much you give, how little you need, and how quietly you endure. And once kindness reaches this point, it no longer reflects who you are. It reflects what you were taught to do to remain acceptable. How kindness becomes self-erasure. When kindness turns into obligation, it doesn't stay neutral. It begins to take something from you. At first, the cost is subtle. You feel tired more often. You feel stretched thin. You tell yourself this is normal, that everyone feels this way. You assume the exhaustion is a personal failure rather than a warning sign. So you push through it. You override your limits. You convince yourself that needing less is a form of maturity. Slowly, the line between generosity and self-neglect disappears. Self-erasure doesn't happen through one big sacrifice. It happens through hundreds of small ones. You cancel plans you were looking forward to. You stay quiet when something bothers you. You adjust your tone, your words, your behavior to avoid discomfort in others. Each moment seems insignificant on its own. Together, they create a pattern where your inner world becomes less visible, even to you. You stop asking yourself what you feel. You focus entirely on what is expected. Psychologically, this pattern is reinforced through conditioning. When kindness is rewarded with acceptance and withdrawal is met with guilt or distance, your nervous system learns a simple rule: your safety depends on giving. Over time, your sense of self becomes externally anchored. You don't evaluate your worth internally. You scan your environment. You measure it through reactions, gratitude, relief, and silence. If others are okay, You assume you are okay too. This is where resentment quietly enters. Not the explosive kind, but the slow burning type. You feel unappreciated, overlooked, taken for granted. But because resentment clashes with your self-image, you suppress it. You tell yourself you're not allowed to feel this way. You rationalize the behavior of others. You minimize your frustration. The emotion doesn't disappear. It just turns inward, where it hardens into bitterness, emotional numbness, or self-directed anger. As this continues, identity erosion accelerates. You no longer know what you want without considering how it will affect someone else. Decisions feel heavy because they require constant calculation. You feel oddly disconnected from joy, spontaneity, and desire. Even rest starts to feel undeserved. You may notice that you feel most yourself only when you're alone, because solitude is the only space where you're not performing usefulness. This form of kindness doesn't make you more loving, it makes you smaller. Your personality flattens, your boundaries dissolve, you become easier to rely on but harder to truly know. People interact with the version of you that is available, not the version that is authentic, and because you've trained yourself to disappear, they often don't realize anything is missing. The tragedy of self-erasure is that it masquerades as virtue. You are praised for being patient, forgiving, understanding, yet no one asks what it costs you to maintain that. And eventually, you don't ask either. You confuse endurance with goodness. You confuse silence with strength. You confuse suffering with meaning. At this stage, kindness no longer connects you to others. It disconnects you from yourself. You may still function, you may still help, but something essential has been traded away. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until the person you are serving the most is no longer included in your own life. Who benefits from your kindness? Once kindness becomes habitual and unguarded, it quietly reshapes the dynamics around you. Not because people are evil, but because human behavior adapts to what is consistently available. When you are always understanding, always flexible, always willing to absorb inconvenience, others learn, often unconsciously, that your limits are negotiable. Your kindness becomes a resource, and like any resource without boundaries, it gets used. Most people don't wake up intending to exploit you. They simply follow the path of least resistance. If you rarely say no, they stop preparing for it. If you don't express discomfort, they assume there is none. If you continue giving without asking for reciprocity, they conclude that none is required. Over time, your generosity rewrites expectations. What once felt like a favor slowly becomes an entitlement. This is where confusion sets in. You notice that people reach out primarily when they need something. Conversations revolve around their problems. Your role becomes supportive, stabilizing, useful, but when you pull back even slightly, the reaction is often subtle disappointment or distance. Not gratitude for what you've given, but discomfort at what is no longer being provided. This is when many kind people internalize blame. They assume they've changed, that they've become colder, that something is wrong with them. The truth is simpler and harder to accept. Your kindness trained others how to treat you. When you consistently deprioritize yourself, you signal that your needs are optional. When you absorb emotional labor without acknowledgement, you teach people that your capacity is infinite. This doesn't make others malicious, it makes them human. People adjust to patterns, not intentions. There is also a deeper psychological layer. Some individuals are drawn to kind people because kindness offers relief without challenge. You don't demand accountability, you don't disrupt comfort, you don't force growth. Your presence feels safe because it asks for nothing in return. For people who are emotionally avoidant, entitled, or overwhelmed themselves, this dynamic is incredibly appealing. They can receive without confronting their own limitations. What often goes unnoticed is how unbalanced this becomes. You begin to feel invisible, not because no one sees you, but because no one is required to see you fully. Your inner world is irrelevant to the role you play. You are valued for consistency, not complexity, for reliability, not reliability, and the more you fulfill this role, the harder it becomes to step out of it without consequences. This is why pulling back can feel so isolating. When your kindness was the glue holding certain relationships together, reducing it exposes what was never built. Some connections weaken, others disappear entirely. This can feel like proof that your worth was conditional, that you were only valued for what you provided, and in many cases, that perception is painfully accurate. However, this awareness is not meant to turn you bitter or suspicious. It is meant to bring clarity. Understanding who benefits from your kindness allows you to see where reciprocity exists and where it doesn't. It helps you distinguish between relationships that value you as a person and those that rely on you as a function. Kindness with boundaries reveals truth. It shows you who respects you, who adapts, and who leaves when the supply changes. And while that loss can hurt, it also marks the end of being quietly drained by relationships that were never designed to nourish you in return. The guilt trap, and why saying no hurts for people who have lived most of their lives being agreeable. Guilt doesn't feel like an emotion, it feels like a moral alarm. When you consider saying no, something inside you tightens. Your chest feels heavy. Your thoughts spiral. You don't just worry about disappointing someone, you worry about being a bad person. This reaction is not random, it is learned. Guilt becomes the internal mechanism that keeps you compliant, long after external pressure disappears. The pain of saying no is rarely about the request itself. It's about what no threatens. For many, kindness was once the price of belonging. Love, safety, or approval came with conditions. You learned that being useful kept you connected and withdrawing made you vulnerable. Over time, your nervous system linked self-protection with danger. So even when you logically understand that a boundary is healthy, your body reacts as if you're risking abandonment. This is why guilt feels overwhelming. It's not just emotional discomfort, it's fear dressed up as morality. You're not afraid of being selfish. You're afraid of being rejected, criticized, or erased. Guilt convinces you that endurance is virtue and that suffering silently makes you worthy. It reframes self-respect as cruelty and self-care as betrayal. Social roles reinforce this trap. Families, workplaces, and relationships often reward the person who never complains and never refuses. You become the reliable one, the strong one, the understanding one. These labels feel affirming at first, but they come with expectations. Once others get used to your availability, boundaries feel like violations rather than adjustments. When you finally hesitate, people may question your character instead of their dependence. That reaction deepens your guilt and makes you doubt yourself. There is also a psychological phenomenon at play. When you've spent years prioritizing others, your sense of identity becomes externally regulated. You feel stable when others are satisfied and unstable when they're not. Saying no disrupts that balance. You feel uneasy not because you've done something wrong, but because you've broken a familiar pattern. Guilt is the withdrawal symptom of people pleasing. What makes this even harder is that guilt doesn't disappear immediately when you start setting boundaries. In fact, it often intensifies. Many people assume this means they're on the wrong path. In reality, it means you're unlearning a deeply ingrained survival strategy. Your mind understands the change before your nervous system does. Emotional discomfort doesn't mean moral failure. It means adjustment. Another layer of pain comes from empathy. Kind people are acutely aware of others' struggles. When you say no, you imagine the inconvenience, the disappointment, the extra burden someone else might carry. This sensitivity makes boundaries feel cruel. Even when they're necessary, you confuse compassion with self-sacrifice. You believe that if you can help, you should regardless of the cost to yourself. But compassion without limits turns into self-abandonment. And self-abandonment breeds quiet resentment. That resentment doesn't make you kinder. It makes you exhausted, irritable, and distant. Over time, the very kindness you're trying to preserve becomes distorted by bitterness and emotional withdrawal. Understanding the guilt trap is not about eliminating guilt overnight. It's about recognizing it for what it is. Guilt is not proof that you are wrong. It is proof that you are changing. Learning to tolerate that discomfort is part of reclaiming yourself. Saying no hurts because it challenges the version of you that was built to survive. But discomfort is often the price of choosing integrity over obligation, and that pain, while real, is temporary. The cost of never saying no is not redefining strength. Kindness and self-respect. True strength is often misunderstood by people who have survived by being agreeable. Strength is not endless endurance. It is not the ability to absorb pain quietly. It is not staying soft while being worn down. Those behaviors may look noble, but they are rooted in fear, not power. Real strength begins when you no longer abandon yourself to maintain peace. It begins when your actions align with your inner limits instead of overriding them. Kindness, when redefined, stops being something you give at your own expense. It becomes something that flows outward only after you are intact. This version of kindness is quieter, firmer, and less performative. It doesn't need approval to exist. It doesn't rush to rescue. It allows others to experience the consequences of their choices without feeling responsible for fixing them. This is not cruelty. It is respect for autonomy, both yours and theirs. Self-respect is the foundation that makes this possible. Without it, kindness collapses into self-erasure. With it, kindness becomes selective and intentional. You no longer give to prove your worth. You give because you choose to. And when you choose not to, you don't justify yourself endlessly. You don't explain your pain to earn permission. You understand that your boundaries do not require validation to be legitimate. This shift changes how relationships function. Some connections will feel strained at first. People accustomed to your constant availability may resist the change. Not because you are wrong, but because the dynamic has changed. When you stop overgiving, you stop cushioning others from discomfort. You stop being the silent stabilizer. And that can feel unsettling, both to them and to you. But discomfort is not damage. It is evidence of recalibration. Redefining kindness also means letting go of the fantasy that being good guarantees being treated well. Kindness does not protect you from being misunderstood, rejected, or taken for granted. Boundaries do more to protect your well-being than virtue ever could. When you accept this, you stop using kindness as armor. You stop expecting it to save you. You start using discernment instead. Strength, in this sense, is the willingness to tolerate disapproval without collapsing. It is the ability to sit with guilt without obeying it. It is choosing honesty over harmony when harmony demands your silence. This does not make you harsh. It makes you grounded. People may see less of you, but what they see will be real. As self-respect grows, something subtle but profound happens. Your nervous system begins to relax. You no longer scan constantly for expectations. You don't feel compelled to earn rest. You give from a place of stability rather than depletion. Kindness returns to being a choice instead of a reflex. And because it is chosen, it becomes sustainable. This is where integrity lives, not in being endlessly accommodating, but in being consistently aligned. When you respect yourself, kindness stops being something that costs you your identity. It becomes an expression of it.